I'm Jessica Clark, and I'm an assistant professor of history here at Western. And I think first we need to thank PBS for actually thinking of Western to do this event. We're really glad to actually have you here. Before we start in with the discussion, I thought we'd let each one of the panel members introduce themselves and tell us where they're from. So, Tom, why don't you go ahead?
Do you think we have to turn the mic on?
Is it on?
Is it wireless? Yeah, my name's Tom Manning. I'm a writer and producer of End of Track. I currently am a freelance producer out of Bozeman, Montana. I've had a long association with Wyoming PBS. I actually used to work there as a writer-producer and produced quite a few documentaries for you guys.
Yes.
I'm Dave Kapka. I once taught history here and brought back memories to have the audio-visual portion of the program suffer. I can remember myself standing here many times saying, "Eric, where's Eric?"
Thank you.
But I've also been at the state of Wyoming and a state historian for a time, and since then I've been, my history part of my life has been as an itinerant historian, wandering around periodically, getting asked to do things. So I appreciate the opportunity to do this. I did a program for the Wyoming Speakers Bureau a few years ago, and it was a very popular program, and in fact is even asked for these days, right, Mr. Hartley? So I hope to use some of the pieces. That was based on primary sources, and I hope to use a few of those tonight.
My name is Bob Nelson. I'm the museum coordinator for the Rock Springs Historical Museum, and I'm here to bring local stories. We collect some of the my big push in the historic end of things is everyone has a story, and it's good to tell. And there's a lot of them that have to do with the railroad. And that's why we're here. So as they came through with the railroad, one of the surveyors said, you know, there's some really good coal there. So the Union Pacific made sure that they made use of all the natural resources as well as the geography to put their rails through. And I'm only talking for the time being, which if you know me is rare. So I'm giving them back the microphone.
I did want to tell you guys that during that construction scene in the that you just saw with the hammering of the spikes, that was Dr. Kafka's voice reading from that newspaper article. And when we shot it, he did it in one take. It was just incredible. And the actual take was much longer. We only used a portion of it. He just nailed it.
Well, the idea for tonight is to have an informal, kind of relaxed panel discussion. We do have some questions that we're going to start off the discussion with, but if at any time you guys have a question, just raise your hand. We have a microphone that I can run around, and you guys can definitely pose questions to our panelists tonight. So we encourage you to get involved in the discussion. Any last things before we get started? Good. I thought we'd start with one of the first talking points that come to mind, and that's the formation of the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific Railroad, the Railroad Act. If you guys want to talk a little bit about the historical context of this, that'd be awesome.
I'm throwing that to you. Okay. Because you were there. Always good to alienate your fellow panelists.
I had to submit some transcripts the other day to the institution here, and Rick Kempa, my friend Rick Kempa, said, well, did they take a wheelbarrow and wheel those brick tablets down, or those stone tablets down to the registrar's office? So you're not the only one. It is really an interesting story in terms of how it came to back. I mean, the story goes way beyond Lincoln saying, gee, I think I'd like to build a railroad. in 1862. The idea had been around, as the film does point out, for a number of years. There have been visionaries who thought of this as a wonderful thing to connect the country and so forth. But it really was the impetus really was, I think, the California gold rush, when all of a sudden you had a piece of the country that was separated by this mass of land that was, to at least the government, unoccupied, because they didn't, of course, consider the Native Americans to be occupants. And they thought, also with the Civil War, it's a good idea maybe to try to tie the country together. So that was one of the reasons for beginning to think more seriously about this. And because there were regional conflicts going on, of course, with the war coming, where they were going to put that was an important aspect. How do you solve that problem? And they actually, the Congress set up in 1853 5 different surveys. They said, let's do this scientifically. The government is going to do this scientifically. We are going to have 5 different routes, potential routes surveyed, and then we will choose from those 5 routes, the best route. Well, of course, the Civil War kind of interrupted that, which eliminated the southern routes. And they did, as the film says, they settled on the route that they settled on, and then the chief engineer comes along and says, I'm going to look at the specifics of that particular route. So it wasn't, Lincoln says they're going to do this, and Grenville Dodge comes out and lays out the route. There was a lot that went on before that. The other thing that they had to deal with was financing. The government at the time had a budget. The government's budget, the United States government's budget, was $17.3 million. The whole budget. They couldn't find a few nickels to build the Union Pacific Railroad or a Transcontinental Railroad out of that. And so they had to look at a problem of financing. How do you finance it? And what did they have? They didn't have money. What did they have? They had land. So they could take the land and find a way to use the land to finance the railroad. And that ultimately is what they did. So that kind of lays a little bit of groundwork, I think, for the coming.
And with the land, they parlayed that, and they became landowners, and they became real estate agents also. The towns of Cheyenne and Laramie, the Union Pacific was selling lots, and they were lining up for them. In Cheyenne, the population, Cheyenne was going to be a division point. That meant that the railroad was going to build infrastructure. They were going to build shops and roundhouses, etc. And when word of that got out, people started flocking to Cheyenne. And so Dodge went out to prospect some more routes, and when he came back, when he left, there was about 500 people in Cheyenne. He was gone for 3 months. When he came back, there were 1,500 people. 1 month later, there were 5,000 people. So Cheyenne got its nickname, the Magic City of the Plains, because it just exploded. And the Union Pacific was making tremendous amount of money at that point just by merely selling land. And the same thing happened in Laramie, too.
And remember, there was no Wyoming at that time. When Cheyenne was being created, there was no Wyoming.
That's right.
And the existence of all these people required them to, they were part of Dakota Territory, so it required them to create something a little closer to this area where these people were coming.
So that was the start of territorial status for Wyoming, because the people in Cheyenne got together and said, we need to do something. We need to have our own territory. And the Dakota Territory was more than happy to be rid of this kind of far-flung suburb of the, and so midway in 1868, while the railroad was still being built, Wyoming achieved territorial status. And then, of course, it went on to statehood. And when you think about it, this is really an interesting proposition, too, because, you know, back east, the railroads were built because there was so much, you know, population at the time. This is really one of the few instances that major transportation like this actually preceded population. So it's kind of, everything was sort of backwards.
Which actually brings up another good talking point. It preceded the populations, so who built it?
Well,
I can touch a little bit on that.
go for it, Bob.
Since I feel left out. And you know. No, okay, all right. Did you get that? So, this, Union Pacific had the same problem with staffing the railroad as they did with staffing their mines. Where are we going to get a workforce? So they went everywhere they could find. A lot of them came from Europe. Now, a misnomer is that the Chinese helped on the eastern side of the railroad, and they did not. They came from the west. But a lot of the Irish came and helped, because at that time it was right in the middle of a lot mass exodus out of Ireland. So you got a lot of people waiting to work, and you could promise a new life. It was they did a wonderful marketing technique when they were asking for workers, because go out west and you could even reinvent yourself. Who's going to check up on you? You could become whatever you wanted, and this will give you the key and the tools by working on the railroad. So. Yeah, paid pretty good too. You know, so there was nowhere to spend your money. Well, there was a few places they had those camps that followed, which is actually what Rock Springs was meant originally going to be. Was just what I call the Hell on Wheels camp, because they had camp followers, which were those girls who were just good sports, who followed along and just were really like cheerleaders, but go with that. And so when they got to Rock Springs, again, I mentioned this before, and their surveyors said, you know, there's a lot of coal seams around here. And they said, well, we're moving on, basically. We're not, you know, we're not staying here. And they said, you might want to think about it. So they did, and developed a subsidiary Union Pacific Coal Company. But, and then a lot of people stayed on. But a lot of people then found their way, the workers along the railroads, and permanently moved out here. They had some investiture of the famous Manifest Destiny, and they helped build America, and they wanted to be a part of it and stay here. And like Tom said, they paid well. So I kind of like this. Can I hold it for a while?
Bob mentioned the coal seams, and one of the things I think is kind of interesting is that the coal was discovered long before it was developed here. Jim Bridger was accompanying one of these survey units, which is actually surveying a wagon road back from Salt Lake City across Wyoming. And the surveyors, one of the interesting things, you know, in this place, Wyoming, that we like to beat up on the federal government, we really wouldn't have been around here much if it hadn't been for the federal government. And these survey units were one of the things that happened. Fur trappers had done their early explorations, but they didn't write things down. And they guided a lot of these government expeditions, and the government expeditions, they wrote things down. They codified, they put it down in books where other people could come and see. But let me just read this little piece from a journal written in the 1850s. At a point 13 miles from the mouth of Bitter Creek. Now, where would that be? 13 miles from the mouth of Bitter Creek. We found a bed of bituminous coal cropping out of the north bluff of the valley, with every indication of it being quite abundant. For the first 7 or 8 miles after entering the valley, the formation was similar to that of Rabbit Hollow and Green River, and the strata horizontal. They then began to dip gradually to the west and northwest until at this point the elevation had reached 20 degrees. The coal was of the same character as that found on Sulphur Creek near the crossing of Bear River, alternated in beds of various thicknesses from a few inches to several feet, with yellowish and light gray sandstones. Major Bridger informed me that about a mile from the mouth of the creek, a large bed existed, which from his description resembled lignite, but which owing to other occupations I had passed without observing. One of the men reported to me that he had noticed it, and he had seen a piece of coal lying in the bed of the creek as long and as thick as a man's body. This had apparently fallen from an outcrop in the south bank, which was about 4 feet in thickness. Major Bridger also stated that a similar bed is to be found to the south of the mouth of Black's Fork, that he had used it for years and that it burned freely with a clear white blaze, leaving little residuum except a small white ash. Again, the mountain men would sit around and talk about these kinds of things amongst themselves. Stansbury, and this is a Stansbury expedition, went home, went back to Washington, D.C., wrote it up, put it where anybody could come and find it, and this became a treasure trove for people who were in the mineral business.
And Stansbury's, actually, you can touch on this too, Stansbury's journals and writings are so accurate that you can actually find this if you know where Dave was talking about. So, Wamsutter. No, I'm kidding. But you can tell his were so accurate you can still use them today. So he was that, and the mountain men are like, yeah, well, we've seen that for, like Dave said, for forever. We knew it was there, you know. So it was just how to use it.
And I think the coal being in this area may have been partially the reason for them not taking the more northerly track that the Oregon Trail followed. That's about 100 miles, you know, to the north of us here. And I think, you know, this great coal resource of the area here is what partially drew them along this line.
Yeah, in the east, the railroads were using wood.
Yeah.
Does that work here?
Quickly.
And with both wood and coal, with firing these steam engines, when they pulled into town, they were just spewing out all this black smoke and hot ash, and it was the prevailing winds took them and deposited them on one part of town, and that part of town became known as the wrong side of the tracks. So that's how that little phrase started. Yes. Yeah.
A lot of those phrases came from the railroad industry.
There's plenty of them that are in our everyday language, making the grade. Yeah.
That's all right. I probably don't need it.
Okay, I guess not.
What I find interesting is the roundhouse built reader, which tells us something about management concept, about the separation of subsidiary coal mine, which of course brought the population. It just is odd that they didn't understand, you know, society in the sense that roundhouse was built in Green River, so management had one thought, and the practicality of people and having to make a living, et cetera, changed the whole dynamic, I believe, of how they built that. Where all were the roundhouses? One in Cheyenne. Rock Springs. There was Rock Springs, and there was one in Bryan. And do any of you know where Bryan is? Oh, yeah. Okay, I figured you did. Does the rest of you know? If you take the frontage road out of Green River on the, is it north? Is it north? Is it north towards the one I showed you? Yeah, the north side. The north side, anyway, it's right past the road to Seedskiddy. There's just a marking there, and then Evanston, too. I don't know whether, I don't think there's another one. You have all these journals from your pen pals.
Yeah, this is from Crofut's New Overland Tourist Journal. Almost immediately after the railroad was put through, there were these tourist journals being published, and you could sit on the train, and then you would follow what was going on, and you could read in your journal where you were and what kinds of things you would see when you got there. And you're talking about roundhouses. When you get to Bitter Creek, at this place, the company have a 10-stall roundhouse and a machine shop for repairs. Remember, these things weren't finely tuned pieces of equipment. They broke down a lot. As we leave this station, we begin the descent of the celebrated Bitter Creek, the valley of which, remember this is a tourist guide, the valley of which we shall follow to Green River about 60 miles west. The valley is narrow, the bluffs coming near the creek on either side. The stream is small and so strongly impregnated with alkali as to be almost useless for a man or beast. So maybe the celebrated Bitter Creek was, a little irony there.
They should have picked a better name then.
From the source of the mouth of this stream, every indication points to the fact that deposits of oil underlie the surface. Coal veins, valuable ones, have been found, and an oil-bearing shale underlies a large portion of the valley. We're looking at about 1870 when this is being written.
Of course, speaking about Green River, when the Union Pacific was coming through, they got to Green River, and there was a consortium there that had already laid claim to the land, and it was not Union Pacific land there. So the railroad, they thought, these fellows thought that they were going to make a killing because they knew that the railroad was going to stop at Green River because it was a great water source. Well, when the railroad found out that the land was already spoken for, they went right past it and created this town of Bryan instead, which is how many miles away, maybe? 15?
10 or 15 is what I was going to say.
And so Bryan was on the Blacks Fork, and they built the town there, and it was thriving for about 3 or 4 years, and then Mother Nature stepped in, and there was a terrible drought, and basically it dried up. And so, tail between their legs, the Union Pacific went back to Green River and said, okay, this is going to be it. And that's how Green River became the railroad town it is today.
Any other questions? Yes?
I don't think that. When did the railroad investigate the coal resource across Wyoming?
Well, again, the mapping of this began with these journals, these federal operations, and there were surveyors, as the film points out, really preceding the laying of the tracks. So that, and those were Union Pacific surveyors. So they're finding this out all the way. Plus, they know about this information here. They know this information from the government surveys.
Well, that was the exact route. When I'm talking, like 20 miles outside right away, studying the ownership of the service around here. Now Anadarko was railroad. They owned and knew of Bridge Coal and all the whole valley here and other places. And in turn, they sold big blocks of land and did not retain coal. And they were right on the money.
Well, they got the money, or they got these because, of course, the checkerboard system, the government gave, well, first they gave, in 1862, the first Union Pacific Railway Act, they gave 10 miles on either side, every other section, to the railroad. As, again, they didn't have money to give, so they gave these. Now they were selling some bonds and so forth, but this is the big deal. And then railroads visionaries said, you got to sweeten that vision a little more. And so 2 years later, in 1864, they passed the second Union Pacific Railroad Act and expanded that to 20 miles. But they did, you're right, they didn't know at that particular time exactly which sections. But I'm guessing that as the surveyors went through and they were building the tracks, they were taking note. And they knew what land they had on either side since 1864. They were getting that land. They could figure out where they were going to sell the land and where they might want to keep it.
And of course, along with the land came the mineral rights
Right.
also. So they had both the land and the mineral rights, the Union Pacific did.
So I know you briefly in the clip it touched on the biological aspect, natural resources of when you consider wildlife in this. How else did the railroad impact, natural resources besides minerals, besides oil?
Right.
And what was there any planning involved with this? You were talking about.
Sorry, the planning back then?
You were talking about strategical government. I work for the BLM. I work with conservation and stuff. So that's why I'm asking is, what was there, if there was any planning, when they came through here? Obviously, the buffalo is the major thing that they talked about.
And I'll just touch on this first real quick. As far as, the wildlife now, they were not really concerned with, they were concerned with getting this railroad across and more for the, getting it done, and then, the esoteric aspect of joining the country to make it one. But don't forget there was money. There was money to run your freight across, and make it get to the other side of the country much quicker. Planning really, like you said, planning, I don't believe actually was that prevalent in those times. And, the only planning I think they would do is to plan the route of least resistance if they came across it. So that would be, waterways were probably impacted to a certain point because you want to stay along the water and as much as you can. But I don't think that there was any, nothing I've ever seen says, we've got to watch out for this or there's planning involved and what would happen in the future. So.
Well, as far as natural resources, though, too, the tie hacks were up in the mountains, and they were just carving up the forest for use, cutting down trees so they could provide the ties. When you think about how many ties were necessary to, go across this great distance, they had spring floats every spring coming down the rivers. And
there's some great pictures in the County Museum of the log jams in Green River.
Yes. Yeah.
And you wouldn't believe, you look at them and go, where do these trees come from? So there was not that. And I think that was also the era where this is abundant, we're opening up this new thing, and we'll never run out.
Yeah.
I think it's an attitude that is, at the time, educational maybe, lack of education, but no one worried about it. It was brand new. This was the opening of the West. This was ours for the taking. So, Dave.
When did the Chinese show up working for Union Pacific in Rock Springs or Wyoming?
Well, let's just preface it by saying that they weren't track workers.
No, they didn't work on the track.
Central Pacific over in California had a huge Chinese contingent, but go ahead, Bob.
Yeah, they didn't come, like I said before and what Tom just said, they didn't come on the tracks from the Cheyenne area. They came to, and how they got here, some of them came helping with the railroad from that way in the state. The majority of Chinese and Asians in this country, it's a very interesting, if you're a history geek like me, it's a very interesting structure how they got here. And what they would do in China and Japan is pay all their money to really like a travel agent, who was not, he was a labor broker, and he would take their money and then he would sell their services to people here. And the Beckwith Quinn, which was a store in Rock Springs, also dealt in Chinese labor. So they came to this country, and really, the people, some of the worst treatment the Chinese and the Japanese got was from that person who was supposed to look out for them and give them the best deal. He would sell them almost as slave labor and into contracts they didn't want to be in. They came because it was a really time of unrest in China, and they realized that they could come here, make a lot of money, and all of them, almost to the person, planned to go home.
And they did bring their families with them.
They did not bring their families with them. And again, I'll do this little quick sidebar. One of the reasons that, because the kids love this when you give tours, one of the reasons that they were thought to be weird, which is interesting because you're in a town of immigrants anyway, everybody was weird, I mean, if you want to look at it that way. They all spoke a different language, had different customs. So for the Chinese to be singled out was unusual. It was baffling to me still. But one of the things they did to show you was that they believed if they died here and did not get, and were buried here, they could not get to their heaven, their version of heaven, unless they were buried in their own homeland. So they would be buried in, they would take the bodies, bury them in small graves, very shallow. In about 6 months, they'd dig them up and break all the bones and scrape all the, whatever was left, skin and everything off the bones, send them back to China then, because you can send that as a package instead of sending a body and going through customs. So they never intended to stay, but they did things like that, which then, again, they just came to, I'm getting off on a tangent, how odd for me, but they just really came to make as much money as they could, saw the opportunity, and then go home.
It was economic incentive for the railroad too, because while they made money, I mean, they thought they were being well paid. They were being paid, and you can go to the Union Pacific Coal Company. What's it called? The book that was done by the coal company.
The UP Coal book. Union Pacific Coal Mines.
Anyway, it's got labor rates in back, and it says white, Chinese, and it's right there. Shows the difference. But Jay Gould, who ended up as one of the of course, entrepreneurs of that era, became involved in the Union Pacific when it was suffering from some financial difficulty. And he was the one who really came up with the idea of really getting a lot of Chinese workers to come out here. And that was the incentive for the railroad. We've got a little financial trouble. The coal companies, part of the railroad, are potentially going to make some money for us. How can we maximize the amount of money that they're going to make?
And didn't the Asian population at one point exceed the Caucasian population?
In certain areas it did, yeah. And they did things like, they saw the opportunity for, along the tracks for things like laundries, believe it or not. I'm not being stereotypic, but they did. And Chinese, the Asians also, especially the Chinese, would never complain. It was not in their nature to say you're not making enough money, and that's why they could pay. That's why there are two rates, and they would never unionize, because that was not in their culture at all where they came from to do that. So they would not unionize, which then led to, that's a whole. Then we get into the Chinese massacre reasons. But getting back to the railroad, so they were good labor. They were dependable, they were cheaper, and they were a good leverage point with the other worker, with the workers around. So they could use them.
During the movement of the railroad across Wyoming, a newspaper accompanied the moving town. How complete a collection exists of the newspaper as it was printed, and how can you obtain it?
Ask Erin. Erin is the expert on this. Erin, let me tell you this really quick. This is Erin. She is if you've ever seen Wyoming Newspaper Project online, which is one of the most incredible resources online, Erin is responsible for this.
Yay!
So let's let Erin.
I love that resource.
Yeah, Erin's
and we're talking about the Frontier Index here, I think.
Yes, the Frontier Index. We digitized all the newspapers from the Wyoming State Archives, and they have the Frontier Index across Wyoming. That's all we have right now. So there is a few issues up there for Fort Steele, I think, and Cheyenne, and all the way over to Fort Bridger, I think.
This was the famous moving newspaper.
Yes, he went along with the other funny newspaper was Sweetwater Mines, which started in Fort Bridger, went up to South Pass City, overwintered in Bryan, and then went back to South Pass. I think they didn't want to stay in South Pass for the winter.
Would you
access it?
WyoNewspapers.org.
It is excellent. I'm serious. No, I'm thanking you. I'm thanking you. You did it. So yeah. So,
you too. That's a wonderful
it
resource.
is. So.
My question is about agriculture, i.e. sheep ranching, or if that's what we have here. Up around Sheridan, of course, we had cattle ranches, etc. They were in there because there was grass. Transportation, the ability to sell sheep. You don't have sheep guys, you have cattle guys. The shipment must have facilitated the development of sheep industry all along the
But you did have sheep drives. They drove sheep all the way from Oregon. Yes. And in Ohio, they drove pigs to market in Ohio.
To market,
So the idea of a driving livestock to market is not. I mean, we think of it as, you're right, the cattle drive and so forth.
But they did drive sheep. That's right.
That they did, but the sheep were moved very slowly across, because they were eating the grass to the roots and what grass there was, and they would come all the way, and then they would go all the way back.
So you don't see those in the movies, the westerns, because they're shorter. They're into the camera. That's right. And, when you're, well, I won't say that, but about sheep, a group of sheep. It's called prom. But anyway,
Bob, you alluded to the racial tensions that existed with having the Chinese here, and you mentioned the Chinese massacre. I was wondering if you guys could share a little bit about that.
sure, that doesn't really have much to do with the railroad at this point. But I mean, what would you like? Would you like to know a quick overview? Or, well, basically, it came from, and I'm not going to go into the whole the minutia of it, but it was done again because of what Tom and I and Dave were saying, that there were different pay structures for the Caucasians and then for the Chinese. When the unions wanted the miners to unionize, a lot of what they sent, what's the word I'm looking for? They sent the rough guys out from the east to rough up the people and kind of threaten them to join the unions, and they used the Chinese, saying, and Union Pacific said, fine, go ahead and strike, we'll just hire more Chinese. So when that happened, they finally got racial tensions built so much that there was an incident in one of the mines, which is number 6, which is basically where Bruce Macy's place is. That's close enough for you, the truck repair out there, was a misunderstanding that happened in the mine underground, where 2 white miners had
That's Stagecoach Drive, just above McDonald's.
Okay, I'm doing the Rock Springs thing. Bruce Macy's place, it's over there. Yeah, what he said, it is above. So next to Wire Brothers. Sorry, I had to throw that in. So anyway, there was a misunderstanding. Coal is mined by rooms. At that time, you worked with a buddy, and as much coal as you got out is what you got paid that day. So, new guy was working and assigning, actually, I think the superintendent was sick, is the story I've gotten. Another guy stepped in, and he wasn't real adept at it, and assigned the room to 2 white men. They went to go to lunch. In the meantime, 2 Chinese came in, and he double booked the room, actually, is what he did. And when the white miners came back, there was a fight underground. No one spoke the same language, and one of the Chinese was killed. This acting superintendent said, okay, this is enough, everybody go home. Go home and cool off. I'm sending you home early. What they did is go to the bars, because there were a lot of them in town, because there was no TV. So you had bars and brothels. So they decided, and I think this is where, from what I know about it, from what I gather, this is where all those hired thugs that were sent out saw their chance, and it moved in and out of the bars, buying drinks, I'm sure, working them up and saying, okay, this is what's happening. They're stealing us, they're stealing from us. So they sent word to Chinatown, and again, I'm telling you the Reader's Digest version of this, but they sent word to Chinatown, the white miners, that said, we will give you until, I believe it was 5 o'clock, to get out of town. And they waited a half hour, and it was 3 o'clock then, and they went in and burned Chinatown, and 28 people were killed. The railroad, there are stories of how the railroad was a major part of that, if you want tied back to the railroad, because the Chinese who were fleeing over the hills, and the hills they went over were behind Ridge Avenue. See, I didn't use anyone's name there, I just used I could give you someone's house, but they went that way and jumped on the train and went to Evanston. Now there are stories too there's a great story about how one of the UP engineers saw the mob coming and saw the Chinese. They got across his track, and he pulled the whole train in between them. And where you were saying in there, where it split the herd, it basically split the herd here and saved all those Chinese lives. So the railroad was, it was used for different things, but mainly the Chinese all came back, by the way. What I think is interesting to tie in too, you talk about the land in Cheyenne. If you go into the archives and read a lot about the Chinese massacre, a lot of deals were struck with Warren, which was Governor Warren at the time, in order to, can you all still hear me? Okay. In order to calm this thing down, Warren said, I'll take a lot of this, but this is what I want. Warren was actually allowed to keep his land along the railroad in Cheyenne. And actually, this is one of my favorites, the train station in Cheyenne was never supposed to be there. I believe that train station was supposed to go to Ogden. And he said, nope, I want that one. And he got it. So the railroad figured into that, and the Chinese, like I said, he came out, he never got off the train. They came out on the train and he never got off. The Chinese all came back to Rock Springs, which I find incredulous. But then the government sent federal troops, and we were the only occupied city in the United States to protect the immigrants from our citizens. And we were occupied for 14 years. So I will stop talking now.
What years was that again? Like 1900? When was that?
The Chinese massacre?
Yeah.
1885. Yeah. Thank you. I can't see. I couldn't see who was talking.
When did Stansbury come through? 1850, was it?
I can't remember the exact date, but right in there, yeah.
And then who were the Blair brothers? How did they tie into this thing? With Blairtown, were they surveyors or something? Or
They were on their own. They were from Scotland and came on their own, and just came out here and saw the potential again. And they had their own mine for a while. Union Pacific really wanted it and got it, because the union, they didn't want to sell because they were doing a lucrative business. They ran the stage stop too in the spring. They were very, very entrepreneurial, and they were very thrifty. And I hate to say that because that's the stereotypic thing with Scottish people, but they were. So they knew how to really make a lot of money, and they were doing very well, especially with their mine. And the Union Pacific got their mine by charging such high shipping rates to ship their coal. They could control that. They couldn't. If the Blair brothers said, no, we're not selling to you, there's nothing much they could do. But if they tripled, doubled, tripled, and quadrupled their shipping rates, they found they could not afford to ship their coal out. UP got it. But they were the first ones here. Really, they were contributed to be the first citizen settlers, whatever you want to say. And it was at the Springs over on Springs Drive. And if you've ever been there, it's not by the monument. It's in Bowker's backyard, across the street from the monument. So, sorry, I said Springs Drive, but I don't know how to say it without the house. So I don't know if that tells you enough, Mark. But they were always here. And then they had a training. They moved their business to Blairtown. So hence the name. But and then of course Leonard's house is still here. Leonard is their grandson, I think, or his son. His grandson. So right in town. Does everybody know where that place is? One of the oldest houses in Rock Springs is the law offices of Hampton and Newman on A Street, right by the Catholic Church. So, and there, if you go in there, they don't mind if you go in there. I found them. We found them some really old pictures when they were just starting to build that house, and had just been there a little while. So they have some really interesting pictures, but they kept it very similar. Again, stop me from talking.
Okay. I've got a story I want to tell you. We talked a bit about compensation of people, and that the railroad workers were paid $2 to $4, and that was good wages and so forth. This is a little piece about what wasn't said was that they also got room and board. So let me explain, read this little piece which tells you the situation with their room and board and so forth. By and large, construction workers lived in portable villages or camps. Most of these were at the rear ends of the tracks and usually consisted of a string of boxcars equipped with bunks in, on top, and underneath where workmen slept. To these were added eating cars, tents, and portable shacks in which such high priority wants as food, clothing, liquor, women, and gambling were satisfied. Company officials made an effort to provide substantial, though not elegant, fare. Buffalo meat was a staple article of food, as also were bacon, hardtack, beans, and coffee. Of course, and then bacon, hardtack, beans, and coffee, bacon, hardtack, beans, and coffee. Food was served systematically, but not always with regard for sanitation. One stationary dining tent consisted of long tables and benches. Tin plates were securely nailed to the tables. After one group of men had eaten and departed, an attendant with a pail of water and a mop swabbed out each plate in rapid succession and thus prepared the tables for the next round of eaters. Quote, "If we don't nail them down, they'll pile one plate on another and take up too much room. This way we can crowd them in," said the man with the mop. I like that story.
I do too. That's how they clean the brothels too. Can you imagine that? I think it's great that these women did that, but how wonderful. Hey, no running water. Sorry, that cracks me up still. So.
Other questions out there? And back there.
So speed was obviously the emphasis in building the railroad, but from the clip we watched, it almost sounded like the Union Pacific Company, once the railroad was finished, like they almost planned to go back and rebuild the railroad or make it stronger and better. Is that what happened? Is that the case?
Absolutely. It was such a slapdash affair. I mean, it was a tremendous amount of work. I mean, they had to, cut through solid granite and all of that. But when the track laying finally happened, it was really kind of slapdash. And after the Golden Spike in 1869 and passenger service started up, yeah, they went, it's basically like painting the Brooklyn Bridge. Once you're finished, you start at the beginning again. And they rerouted a lot of it. They saved a lot of money over time by rerouting and eliminating, making a straighter line and eliminating. But they also really rebuilt the tracks too, right, David?
But remember, they also went bankrupt.
They did.
Within a few years, 20, 30 years after they had built this, they had been rebuilding and trying to do all this and trying to make the thing work economically and so forth. And ultimately, almost all of those major railroad companies went bankrupt and had to be reorganized. As a result of that, there's a historian by the name of Richard White, a Western historian, who argues that in fact the railroad should not have been built then. It was a bad idea. We've just come to accept that this was such a wonderful, exciting thing. This was the space program for the 1860s. But if you look at it from an economic standpoint, it probably was a lot of wasted money and time and so forth, very inefficiently done. I mean, should you really have gone back, or should you have built it slower over a much longer period of time and saved money and not had to rebuild and rebuild and rebuild? And one of the things I think is interesting, even at the time, there were people who thought that this was a crazy idea. This comes from a journal of a guy who lived in Laramie, and he wrote a journal and he also sent letters back and forth to his family in Illinois. And he has some wonderful observations on things. This is one where, as they're almost finishing the railroad, and he's hearing about this, the railroad has come through Laramie and so forth. He says, "It seems the nearer the road comes to completion, the more reckless or careless become the managers of what some call the great humbug." This is a guy just living in Laramie, and he's picked up this business about this is a scam. This is not working out. It's the great humbug. There's now only 10 or 15 miles of track to be laid when the two roads meet. Some trouble is anticipated from the employees on that event. Now that the road is completed, this is a little bit later now, many of the employees are returning to the States. That also tells you how far this was from civilization. They're returning to the States. The success of the road depends on through freight, but we'll have to compete with ships going by ocean And unless freight can be carried this way as cheap as by steamer, I predict an utter failure of the great overland route vis-a-vis the Union Pacific Railroad. Time will develop many things, and the road may prove a good investment. But just now, it looks like bad for success. You don't usually hear that kind of statement being made about the railroad. It's usually this excitement about what's being done. So it was doubted even then.
I also think the railroad did an incredible job, if you go back and look, on marketing for the time it was in, because they didn't have obviously the media and the coverage that we have. But they really hyped it up, and this is unusual, like you said. That this gentleman's, and while more people may have felt the way, it's rare to hear this. Everybody was happy about it. Like I said, I think it's a remarkable marketing campaign that went along with it. Everybody was just delighted, for the most part.
Did the Union Pacific own both ends?
No.
No.
Central Pacific was a separate entity. And, this great race, and of course they had to go over the Sierra Nevada almost immediately. And so that slowed them down, really fast. Whereas the only real mountainous area that the Union Pacific had to go through was to get over the Laramie Range, which they called the Black Hills in those days. But basically it was this, it's this huge race, and the Union Pacific won.
And remember, they got paid by the mile, and then at one point there was thought going on in the railroad people. Let's not connect. we're making money now.
They actually had surveys that were going right past each other. Yeah. Yeah, they were rushing to get it just to get it done.
Incentives at the end for that golden spike. Wasn't there something with that too? There were certain incentives if you reached that point by a certain time. Or am I making that up?
No.
Well, in my family there was. There were people from way back. So.
I've read in various histories and articles that part of the reason for the way the track was built, because they were paid so much by the mile, and so the faster that they could go, the more miles they could lay. I know that in one railroad in Wisconsin, when it was laid early on, they didn't even grade for track. They merely laid the ties, fastened the rails to the ties, and the first engine across it actually sank the rails and derailed. But I read that that was part of the reason for the shoddiness of the way the railroad was built through Wyoming and other places, was to get as much money, because the railroad was already broke during the time in which they built it. Is that pretty much?
No, there was some skimming going on too.
Yeah, quite a bit of skimming. And it's kind of interesting too, because they did want to get it built, and they did want to go fast, and they did want to put it on this straight line, except for this guy named Thomas Durant, who you saw in the clip there, and he was, going, well, maybe we could slow up a little bit because we'll do this big bow, and we'll, he had his own surveyors that were kind of going against Dodge, and it just was kind of a mess. But basically, you're right. They wanted to get it done, and they had to go back and rebuild it.
Who was
Ames?
Oaks and Oliver.
Oaks and Oliver Ames. Ames was a congressman from Massachusetts, a U.S. congressman from Massachusetts, who Lincoln specifically asked to get this thing rolling.
The Ames brothers owned a shovel company.
Called Ames Shovel Works. Yeah, the Ames Old Colony
So
Shovel.
they were into construction, and
Yeah.
and so they created the economic structure for this, which also called Credit Mobile, which was the way of funneling money to congressmen.
And it turned out to be a huge scandal, and a lot of congressmen were involved in the scandal, but they kind of singled out this Oaks Ames, and he was censured, and he was censured, and 3 months later he died of a stroke, I guess from just the extreme extreme pressure he had been under.
And as a result, the Union Pacific Railroad built a monument to him in Wyoming.
Yeah, he and his brother, yeah. That's right.
It's between Laramie and Cheyenne,
Yeah.
just off the road. They just
Yeah.
just finished remodeling. It has a national landmark status.
Yeah.
What is Emily?
Well, no, there's a lot of greats involved there, but a descendant of Oaks Ames.
She's really, there's a woman that we all know, that has been really working tirelessly to get, she got it on the register. She wants the government to pardon him.
Yes. And when you see the film on Sunday, March 10th at 7 p.m., she's in it.
That's really interesting because we've all just seen Lincoln.
Yeah, right.
And if you've ever well portrayed it, pay him.
Yeah,
If we want to pass this,
yeah,
buy a few votes. So
that's
it
right.
wasn't like it sounds like that he was so often more.
Yeah.
He wasn't.
Is there any last minute questions or comments? Somebody have one? Do you guys have closing comments that you'd like to make?
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks,
Oh,
everybody.
Dave took mine.
Thanks, everybody,
Did you
for
have a
coming
question?
tonight.
She did have a question over
Who
there.
has a question over here?
Oh,
Here.
okay.
You, with the baseball cap.
My question is, we talked about like the benefits and the consequences of the humans with the railroad, and there was obviously a little bit of consequence for the wildlife and the forest. Do you guys think there was any benefits at all for like forest management or any of the wildlife because of the railroad?
Well, that's a hard question.
Let's see, they cut the forest down for ties,
Yeah.
and they shot,
And they split the herds.
the tourists would also come out right in the railroad cars
And
and shoot buffalo outside there, and then they just leave them lay.
And then they brought people from
No, I
Europe
can't see
to
any.
shoot. I can't either, but it's a different time.
There was no sense of ecology
No,
back
there was
then.
not, I mean,
It really
so that's
wasn't.
a hard question to answer, like I said before, because what Dave said and Tom said is just right, is correct, but there was no thought of that, so we're looking back in hindsight, can we pull anything good out of this? It's like saying Hitler was a good dancer. It doesn't really fit, so, but I mean, I know what you're saying, but no, really, there was no, it didn't help them, so,
Then what about scientific advancement? Anything, well, you have surveying, but anything else that benefited the scientific community? Was there advances in the steam engine, the use of coal, anything like that?
I'm not aware of the technological things. I mean, I think, to me, a lot of the scientific advances came actually while we were sending out these government surveyors. I mean, like Lewis and Clark. There's a lot of science knowledge came out of the Lewis and Clark expedition. And so when the government starts sending out expedition after expedition in the mid part of the 19th century, that is collecting practical information, but it's also collecting what can be used ultimately through observation. They're collecting scientific information. So the whole process, if you look at the whole process, yes, were scientific advances, but I'm not sure.
I'm not sure that's documented.
I've never seen that argument.
No, but I think that, like you said, I think a lot of this was, they learned things out of necessity, like the lack of humidity in Wyoming and moisture in the air. That's gonna cause you to do things differently. Out of necessity, that's scientific, but you're learning as you're going. But I don't know that anything was ever because of it.
They learned how to make ties last a little longer by this burnitizing process, which I think was a zinc process, pre-creosote. Yeah.
What happened was that they were using cottonwood for ties.
Yeah.
It didn't last well.
So
they were trying to find ways to make it last longer. Right. Burnitizing was one way to do that. But that's more, I wouldn't call that science.
I would call that evolution. It just doesn't work what it does. So.
Okay, I have a quick announcement. If anybody still wants to enter into the drawing, please raise your hand and she will come up and give you one.
Nobody asked us.
Me too, yeah.
And again, we want to thank you all for coming tonight. And if you have any questions questions for our panelists individually, I'm sure they'd be happy to answer them and mingle with you guys. So thank you all for coming.
Thanks for coming.